Matthew Hayes sat at his usual corner table, his sharp blue suit slightly wrinkled from a long day of meetings. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the cozy cafe, mingling with the faint hum of soft jazz playing in the background. He glanced at his watch for the third time in 10 minutes, its polished face glinting in the evening sunlight streaming through the tall windows. A deep sigh escaped his lips. His 30th birthday, another year older, another year spent chasing the illusion of success, while his heart felt emptier than ever. The faint jingle of the cafe door caught his attention, but it wasn't David. Matthew leaned back in his chair, trying to suppress the growing annoyance. He'd rearranged his packed schedule to meet his childhood best friend, but now it seemed David had forgotten the importance of today. "Excuse me, sir, would you like a refill?" The voice startled him. He looked up to see a young woman holding a coffee pot, her auburn hair tied back in a loose braid. Her uniform was plain, but her warm smile stood out against the dull backdrop of his day. "Sure, thanks," Matthew replied, pushing his cup closer. She poured the coffee gracefully, her hand steady despite the hustle of the busy cafe. "Long day?" she asked, her tone light but genuine. "You could say that," he replied, forcing a polite smile. He hesitated, then added, "Actually, it's my birthday. Was supposed to meet a friend, but I guess plans changed." Her eyes lit up with surprise. "Happy birthday. Spending it here, though, that's unique." "It wasn't the plan," he said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. "But I guess life has a sense of humor." She laughed softly. "Well, happy birthday anyway. I hope the day surprises you in a good way before it's over." "Thanks, Lila," she said. "Lila Hart." "Thanks, Lila," Matthew replied, offering a faint but genuine smile. As she walked away, he found himself oddly comforted by the brief exchange. Matthew stared out the window, watching the world move on the other side of the glass. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the table betrayed his growing frustration. His phone buzzed, and he grabbed it with a mix of hope and resignation. It was David. "Matt, I'm so sorry, man." David's voice came through the line, muffled and hurried. "Something came up at the restaurant. One of my chefs didn't show, and we're slammed tonight. Rain check." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Yeah, sure. Don't worry about it," he said, his tone measured, though the sting was undeniable. "Thanks, buddy. I owe you one," David replied, oblivious to the disappointment he'd just deepened. Matthew hung up without another word and set the phone down harder than he intended. He rubbed his temples, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't quite pin down. 30 years, a successful career, a penthouse apartment, a fiancée whose beauty turned heads wherever they went. Yet, sitting here alone on his birthday, Matthew couldn't shake the hollow feeling in his chest. "Excuse me?" Lila's voice interrupted again, softer this time. "I noticed you didn't touch your coffee. Everything okay?" Matthew glanced up, surprised by her attention. "Yeah, just thinking too much, I guess." She tilted her head slightly, her curiosity evident. "Big thoughts for a big day?" "Something like that," he said, his lip quirking into a half-smile. Before she could respond, the cafe door swung open again, and a group of lively customers filled the space with chatter. Lila gave him an apologetic glance and moved to greet the newcomers. Matthew took a long sip of his coffee, letting its warmth spread through him. He watched Lila move effortlessly around the cafe, her demeanor kind and unhurried despite the growing demands. There was something refreshing about her, a stark contrast to the polished, calculated world he inhabited. His phone buzzed again, pulling him back to reality. This time it was a message from Charlotte. "Happy birthday, darling. Can't wait to see you this weekend. Love you." The words felt hollow. Charlotte had sent the same generic text for the past 3 years, always delivered with perfect timing but devoid of true sentiment. He typed a brief response and set the phone down, his gaze returning to Lila. She was laughing with a customer, her genuine smile reaching her eyes. A pang of envy hit him. How long had it been since he'd laughed like that, with no reservations or pretenses? Before he could delve deeper into his thoughts, Lila returned to his table, a small plate in her hands. On the house, she said, setting a slice of chocolate cake in front of him. What's this? Matthew asked, genuinely surprised. Consider it a birthday gift, she said with a shrug. Everyone deserves a little something sweet on their day. For the first time that evening, Matthew's smile reached his eyes. Thank you, Lila. That's really kind of you. It's just cake, she said with a playful wink, but her expression softened. Hope it helps a little. As she walked away, Matthew stared at the slice of cake, his chest tightening with unexpected emotion. It wasn't the cake itself, it was the gesture. Small, simple, and entirely without expectation. It had been a long time since anyone had done something for him without wanting something in return. The cafe's hum softened as the evening wore on, and Matthew found himself lingering long after he'd finished the cake. When he finally stood to leave, he approached the counter to settle his bill. Lila, he said, catching her attention, thanks for the cake, the coffee, and just for being you, I guess. She looked surprised, but her smile returned. You're welcome. Have a good night, Matthew, and happy birthday again. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Matthew felt a strange mix of emotions. The hollow ache was still there, but it was tempered by something else, something quieter and warmer. He glanced back at the cafe, the light spilling onto the sidewalk, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, the day had surprised him after all. Tomorrow would be another grind, another day spent climbing the never-ending ladder. But tonight, he let himself savor the faint flicker of hope that maybe, somewhere in the simplicity of moments like these, he might find something real, something lasting. The city buzzed around him as he walked toward his car, the night full of unanswered questions and possibilities. The soft chime of his apartment elevator felt almost deafening in the stillness of the night. Matthew stepped into his penthouse, its sleek modern design cold and impersonal despite the breathtaking view of Chicago's glittering skyline. He set his key on the marble counter and poured himself a glass of scotch. The amber liquid caught the dim light as he swirled it absently, staring out at the city. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. It was another message from Charlotte. Hope you had a wonderful day, love. Don't forget about brunch with my parents on Sunday. He frowned, the tension in his chest tightening. Charlotte's texts always felt more like reminders than genuine conversation, perfunctory, like checking a box. With a deep sigh, he downed the scotch in one gulp and placed the glass down harder than he intended. The hollow clink echoed in the empty space. The weight of the day lingered as he loosened his tie and slumped onto the leather couch. His thoughts drifted to Lila. Her genuine warmth had been a stark contrast to Charlotte's polished perfection. Lila had laughed with her whole being, her kindness unguarded. The way she had noticed his mood and offered the cake, it was so simple, yet it had touched him deeply. The sound of his ringtone jarred him, and he fumbled for the phone, surprised to see his father's name on the screen. Dad, he answered, trying to mask the exhaustion in his voice. Matthew. Richard Hayes's voice was firm, as always. Happy birthday, son. I trust it was productive. Matthew smirked bitterly. Even his birthday was about productivity. It was fine, Dad. Thanks for calling. Good. Listen, we need to talk about Charlotte. Matthew sat up straighter, a familiar tension creeping into his shoulders. What about her? Richard's tone was measured, but carried the weight of expectation. You've been engaged for nearly 2 years now. It's time to finalize things. Her family is influential, Matthew. You know how valuable this alliance could be for the business. I didn't realize my engagement was a corporate merger, Matthew said, his voice sharp. Richard's sigh crackled through the line. Don't be dramatic. You and Charlotte are a good match. She understands our world, our lifestyle. You need someone like her by your side. Matthew clenched his jaw, his father's words reigniting a frustration that had simmered for months. Dad, I don't even know if she loves me for who I am or for what I have. There was a long pause on the other end. That's nonsense, Matthew. Charlotte is devoted to you. Stop doubting everything and focus on what's important. The line went dead, leaving Matthew staring at the phone in his hand. He let it drop onto the couch beside him, his heart pounding. He knew his father's intentions were rooted in the business. Always the business. But Matthew couldn't shake the growing doubt that Charlotte's love wasn't real, that it was just as transactional as his father's ambitions. The following morning, Matthew arrived at Hayes Real Estate's headquarters downtown. The building's imposing facade of glass and steel reflected the busy streets below, a testament to the empire his family had built over 3 generations. Margaret Blake, the company's sharp CFO, was already waiting for him in his office, her tablet in hand. "Good morning, Matthew," she said briskly. "Happy belated birthday. I assume you've seen the Q3 projections I sent last night?" Matthew nodded, sitting behind his sleek desk. "Yes, Margaret, they look solid. But I need to talk to you about something else." Her brow furrowed slightly as she sat across from him. "What's on your mind?" "I need your help with a personal matter," he said, hesitating. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Personal? That's not like you, Matthew." "I know," he admitted. "But this is important. I need to know if someone in my life is genuine." She leaned back, her gaze narrowing. "Charlotte's?" Matthew nodded. "I'm not sure she's with me for the right reasons, and I need to find out before I make any more commitments." Margaret's expression softened, a rare flicker of concern breaking through her usual stoicism. "What do you want me to do?" "I want to stage a financial crisis," Matthew said, the words feeling surreal even as he spoke them. "I want to see how she reacts if she thinks I've lost everything." Margaret stared at him for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "Matthew, this is risky." "My father doesn't need to know," Matthew interjected. "This is between us." She hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "All right. But this stays between us, Matthew. If it backfires." "It won't," he said firmly, though doubt lingered in his own mind. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and strategy sessions, but Matthew's thoughts were elsewhere. He replayed his conversations with Charlotte, analyzing her words and actions, searching for clues he might have missed. That evening, he met Charlotte for dinner at an exclusive restaurant she had chosen. She arrived fashionably late, her designer dress clinging perfectly to her slender figure. "Happy belated birthday, darling," she said, kissing his cheek as she slid into the seat across from him. "Sorry I couldn't celebrate with you yesterday. I had a spa appointment I couldn't reschedule." Matthew forced a smile. "It's fine. Thanks for making time tonight." As they ordered, Charlotte launched into a monologue about her upcoming gala plans, her latest shopping spree, and her family's weekend retreat in Napa Valley. Matthew listened, his responses automatic, his mind racing with the plan he and Margaret had set in motion. Finally, as dessert was served, he cleared his throat. "Charlotte, there's something I need to tell you." She looked up from her phone, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" "I got some bad news today," he said, forcing his voice to sound hesitant. "The company is in trouble, major trouble. We're on the brink of bankruptcy." Her fork paused midair, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around it. "What do you mean, bankruptcy? How could that happen?" Matthew hesitated, watching her closely. "It's complicated, but the bottom line is I might lose everything." Charlotte's expression shifted. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she masked it with a strained smile. "Darling, don't worry. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You always do." Her tone was light, but the tension in her eyes betrayed her unease. Matthew felt his chest tighten as he waited for her next words. "I mean," she continued, her voice faltering slightly, "maybe this is a good time to reassess things. Focus on what's realistic." "What do you mean by a realistic?" he asked, his voice dropping. She gave a nervous laugh. "Well, it might be hard to keep up the lifestyle we're used to. Maybe we should take a step back. Think about our future." Matthew's stomach churned as she trailed off, her words confirming the doubts he'd tried so hard to suppress. He set his fork down carefully, his gaze steady on hers. "I see," he said quietly. Charlotte's smile was brittle. "Don't worry, darling. We'll figure it out." But Matthew could see the cracks in her facade, and for the first time, he realized just how fragile their relationship truly was. The early morning sunlight filtered through the towering glass windows of Hayes Real Estate headquarters, casting long streaks of light across the polished floors. Matthew arrived earlier than usual, his mind clouded with the events of the previous evening. Charlotte's strained smile and carefully chosen words played on a loop in his head, each moment dissected and analyzed. He couldn't unsee the hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of self-preservation that overshadowed her assurances. Margaret Blake was already seated in his office when he walked in. Her usual crisp black suit was immaculate, and her expression was unreadable, but the slight arch of her brow signaled she was expecting answers. "Rough night?" she asked, cutting through the silence with her no-nonsense tone. Matthew tossed his briefcase onto the desk and loosened his tie. "You could say that." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Did she pass the test?" Matthew sighed heavily, sinking into his seat. "Not exactly. She didn't outright leave, but she's already planting seeds about stepping back and reassessing. That's code for run while you can, isn't it?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not promising," Matthew admitted. "But we need to push further. You're not going to get a definitive answer with vague hypotheticals." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We need to escalate, make it feel real." Margaret tapped her tablet thoughtfully. "We can craft a press release. Something about restructuring, layoffs, project failures. The kind of news that'll hit the headlines and get everyone in the industry talking." Matthew hesitated, a pang of unease gripping him. "What about the employees? The team? I don't want to cause unnecessary panic." "We can limit the scope of the announcement internally," she replied. "Keep it vague, but impactful. The key is to make it public enough that Charlotte, and anyone else watching, will believe it." He nodded slowly. "Do it. Let's see how deep her loyalty runs." Margaret stood and gave a curt nod before leaving the office, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Matthew leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the weight of what he was doing, but he also couldn't ignore the growing doubt that had been festering for months. Better to face the truth now than live a lie later. Later that afternoon, the announcement went live. A statement from Hayes Real Estate circulated online, citing unexpected market challenges and the company's decision to restructure key projects. While vague, the language was ominous enough to stir murmurs among competitors and send ripples through their client base. Matthew's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages. He ignored most of them, waiting for one name to appear on the screen. When it finally did, he hesitated, staring at Charlotte's name before swiping to answer. "Matthew, what's going on?" Her voice was sharp, more demanding than concerned. "I just saw the news. Why didn't you tell me this was coming?" "I didn't want to worry you," he said evenly, though his stomach churned at her tone. "It's a lot to handle right now." "A lot to handle?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Matthew, this affects me too. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? People are asking me questions I don't have answers to." "Embarrassing?" he asked, his tone hardening. "That's what you're worried about." There was a pause on the line, and he could hear her breathing quicken. "Of course I'm worried about you. But this isn't just about us. It's my family's reputation." "Charlotte," he interrupted, his voice cold. "If this ruins your image, feel free to walk away. No one's forcing you to stay." Her silence was deafening. For a moment, Matthew thought she had hung up, but then she spoke, her voice low and brittle. "I think we need to talk. In person?" "Fine," he said shortly. "Tonight." "My place." The line went dead, and Matthew dropped the phone onto his desk, his chest tightening. He had expected this, prepared for it, but it didn't make it hurt any less. That evening, the penthouse felt colder than usual, the modern decor stark and unwelcoming. Matthew poured himself a drink, his fingers gripping the glass tightly as he waited. When the doorbell finally rang, he braced himself, setting the glass down before walking to the door. Charlotte stood on the other side, her expression carefully composed. She looked flawless, as always, but her eyes betrayed a mixture of frustration and hesitation. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. She entered, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors. "Matthew, what's happening? This doesn't make sense. Your company has always been solid. How did this happen so suddenly?" He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her arms crossed tightly. "Things changed, Charlotte. Markets shift. It's business. Don't give me that, she snapped. You're hiding something. This doesn't feel real. Her words struck a chord, and Matthew's jaw tightened. Are you implying I'm lying? I don't know what I'm implying, she said, her voice rising. I can't believe you didn't tell me. I've been your partner for years, Matthew. Or at least I thought I was. He took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. And what would you have done differently, Charlotte? Stood by me? Or started planning your exit? She flinched, her carefully crafted demeanor cracking. That's not fair. Isn't it? He pressed. Because it feels like the only thing you're worried about right now is how this affects you. Her silence was damning, her eyes darting away as if searching for an escape. I need time to think, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew nodded, his chest heavy. Take all the time you need. She looked at him one last time before turning and walking toward the door. The soft click as it closed behind her echoed through the penthouse, leaving Matthew alone with his thoughts. The truth was clearer now than ever. Charlotte's love was conditional, and deep down, he had always known it. The buzz of his phone broke the silence. This time, it wasn't Charlotte. It was Lila. Hey, her voice came through, warm and steady. I don't know if you're busy, but I was baking tonight and made way too much. Thought you might want some. Matthew blinked, caught off guard by her unexpected call. Lila, yeah, I'd love that. Great, she said, her smile audible through the phone. I'll swing by in a bit. For the first time that day, Matthew felt his shoulders relax. Maybe tonight didn't have to end on such a sour note after all. The soft knock on Matthew's door broke the stillness of the night. He rose from the couch, his footsteps echoing against the cold marble floors. Opening the door, he found Lila standing there, a bright smile on her face, a simple tote bag slung over her shoulder. The warm, inviting aroma of fresh-baked goods wafted in with her. Hey, she said, holding up a neatly wrapped loaf of bread and a small container. I figured banana bread and some homemade jam might cheer you up. Matthew chuckled softly, the corner of his mouth lifting into a faint smile. You didn't have to go through the trouble. It wasn't trouble, she said, stepping inside when he gestured her in. Honestly, I just bake when I'm stressed, so consider yourself a lucky recipient. Her casual tone was disarming, and Matthew found himself relaxing for the first time that evening. Rough day for you too, huh? You could say that, she admitted, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. She glanced around, taking in the penthouse's sleek modern design. Wow, your place is intense. Not a single knickknack or cozy corner in sight. Guilty, Matthew replied, leaning against the counter as he watched her unpack. I guess I never got around to making it feel like home. She looked at him over her shoulder, her expression softening. Maybe you're too busy building homes for everyone else. He paused, her words hitting closer to home than she realized. As Lila unwrapped the banana bread and began slicing it, Matthew grabbed plates and set them on the counter. The casual domesticity of the moment caught him off guard. It felt different, simple, comforting. So, Lila began, her voice light but curious. I saw the news. Hayes real estate restructuring. Is it as bad as it sounds? Matthew stiffened slightly, but forced his expression to remain neutral. It's complicated. The market's been tough. Lila nodded thoughtfully. I get that. It's been a hard year for a lot of people. But if anyone can turn things around, it's you, right? Her genuine confidence in him made Matthew pause. There was no trace of judgment or fear in her voice, only quiet encouragement. I hope so, he said finally, his tone softer. They carried their plates to the living room and settled on the couch. Lila tucked her legs under her, balancing her plate on her knee. So, tell me, she said with a teasing grin, what do you do when you're not saving the real estate worlds? Matthew smirked. You mean when I'm not buried in contracts and spreadsheets? Exactly, she replied, her grin widening. I used to play guitar, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. Haven't touched it in years, though. Her eyes lit up. No way. You're one of those mysterious business types who secretly write songs about heartbreak. Something like that, he said with a laugh. What about you? Besides baking and making everyone's day better? Her smile faltered slightly, and she glanced down at her plate. I'm trying to save up to open my own bakery. It's been my dream since I was a kid, but life keeps getting in the way. Matthew studied her for a moment, noting the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. Life has a way of doing that, he said quietly. But you're the kind of person who makes things happen. I can see it. She looked up at him, a mixture of gratitude and surprise in her expression. Thanks, Matthew. That means a lot. They fell into a comfortable silence, the city lights casting a soft glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. For the first time in years, Matthew felt like he could breathe, like he wasn't performing or meeting someone else's expectations. Just as he was about to say something, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up with Charlotte's name. Lila glanced at it briefly before looking away, her expression unreadable. You can get that if you need to, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Matthew hesitated, staring at the phone before silencing it. It can wait. Lila raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. Instead, she changed the subject, and they spent the next hour talking about everything, from music to their favorite Chicago neighborhoods. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and for the first time in a long while, Matthew felt truly present. When Lila finally stood to leave, Matthew walked her to the door. She turned to him before stepping out, her expression thoughtful. You know, she said, I think you're doing better than you give yourself credit for. Thanks, Lila, he said, his voice genuine. And thanks for the bread. You might have just ruined store-bought for me forever. She laughed, the sound light and musical. Glad to be of service. Good night, Matthew. Good night. As the door closed behind her, Matthew leaned against it, his mind racing. Lila was nothing like Charlotte. Her warmth, her kindness, her sincerity, it was refreshing and terrifying all at once. His phone buzzed again, and this time he picked it up. Another message from Charlotte. We need to talk. Call me when you can. Matthew stared at the message, his jaw tightening. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but he also knew it wouldn't change anything. He set the phone down and headed to bed, his thoughts lingering on Lila's laughter and the way she had made the world feel just a little brighter. The next morning, Matthew arrived at the office to find Margaret waiting for him, her expression grim. We need to talk, she said, closing the door behind her. Let me guess, Matthew said, sinking into his chair. The press release stirred up trouble. That's an understatement, she replied, handing him her tablet. The board's already buzzing with questions, and some of our biggest clients are panicking. It's all manageable for now, but it's clear the news isn't going unnoticed. Matthew scanned the headlines, his stomach sinking.
We expected this, he said.
Sure, Margaret said, but the question is, how far are you willing to go with this? If you keep this up, it won't just be Charlotte questioning your stability. It'll be the whole city. He set the tablet down, rubbing his temples. I'll handle it. For now, let's focus on damage control. Margaret hesitated before leaning forward, her voice lowering. Matthew, I've known you a long time. This thing with Charlotte, is it worth risking everything you've built? He looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. If she can't handle this, then she's not the person I thought she was. And I need to know that before it's too late. Margaret nodded slowly. All right. Just be careful. This isn't a game. As she left, Matthew leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. He was walking a dangerous line, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was finally getting closer to the truth. That evening, as he left the office, his phone buzzed with another message. This time it was from Lila. Thanks again for last night. Hope today wasn't too crazy. Matthew smiled, typing a quick response before slipping the phone into his pocket. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The rain drizzled softly against the towering windows of Matthew's office, creating faint patterns on the glass. The hum of the city below was muffled, the usual chaos of Chicago's streets reduced to a distant murmur. Matthew sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the skyline, but his mind was elsewhere. His phone sat face down on the desk, Charlotte's unanswered messages weighing heavily in the air. Despite the chaos the staged crisis had caused, he couldn't bring himself to focus entirely on work. His thoughts kept circling back to Lila, the way her laughter had filled the empty void of his penthouse, the way her words had soothed his frayed nerves. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him without an agenda or expectation. A soft knock on his office door interrupted his reverie. Margaret stepped in, her expression a mixture of concern and urgency. "We've got a situation," she said, closing the door behind her. "What now?" Matthew asked, leaning forward. "Victor Reed," Margaret replied, her tone sharp. "Charlotte's father. He's been poking around, asking questions about the company's financials, and he's not being subtle about it." Matthew's jaw tightened. "What's he looking for?" Margaret shrugged, her eyes narrowing. "Leverage, I'd guess. Or confirmation that the rumors are true. Either way, it's not good." Matthew leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Victor Reed wasn't a man who dealt in idle curiosity. If he was sniffing around, it meant he was already calculating how to turn the situation to his advantage. "Keep an eye on it," Matthew said finally. "Let me know if he digs any deeper." Margaret hesitated before speaking again. "And Charlotte?" Matthew exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "She's not handling it well." Margaret tilted her head, studying him, then Lila. The question caught him off guard, but Margaret's expression remained steady, almost curious. "What about her?" he asked, his tone defensive. Margaret allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "Nothing. Just, you seem lighter when you talk about her, that's all." Before Matthew could respond, Margaret turned and left, leaving him alone with her words and the lingering tension in the room. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, each one more draining than the last. By the time he left the office, the rain had intensified, turning the streets into shimmering rivers of light. Matthew pulled his coat tighter around him as he stepped outside, the cold biting against his skin. He considered heading straight home, but found himself driving toward the cafe instead. When he arrived, the warm glow of the cafe's interior was a stark contrast to the dreary night outside. Lila was behind the counter, her auburn hair falling loosely around her face as she laughed with a customer. The sight of her immediately eased the tension in his chest, and he couldn't help but smile as he walked in. "Matthew," she said, her eyes lighting up as she noticed him. "Back so soon? You're going to make people think you're addicted to coffee." "Maybe I'm just addicted to the company," he replied, his tone lighter than it had been all day. Lila chuckled, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Well, in that case, I guess I'll allow it. What can I get you?" "Surprise me?" Matthew leaned against the counter as she set to work. Her movements were quick and efficient. A few minutes later, she handed him a steaming cup with a playful smile. "Hazelnut latte with a hint of caramel. Trust me, it'll make your night better." Matthew took a sip, the rich flavors warming him instantly. "You weren't kidding. This is amazing." "Of course it is," she said teasingly. "I made it." They both laughed, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. But as Matthew glanced around the cafe, his eyes caught on a man sitting in the corner, his sharp suit and piercing gaze unmistakable. Victor Reed. Matthew's heart sank as Victor's gaze met his, a faint smirk playing on his lips. The older man stood and approached, his presence commanding the room despite the casual setting. "Matthew," Victor said smoothly, extending a hand. "Fancy meeting you here." "Victor," Matthew replied, shaking his hand reluctantly. "What brings you to this side of town?" "Oh, just grabbing a coffee," Victor said, his tone dripping with false casualness. His eyes flicked briefly to Lila, who was watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. "And who might this be?" "This is Lila," Matthew said evenly. "A friend." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A pleasure to meet you, Lila." Lila nodded politely, though her eyes darted to Matthew, sensing the tension between the two men. "Nice to meet you, too." "Well," Victor continued, turning his attention back to Matthew, "I won't keep you, but we should talk soon. There are matters we need to discuss." Matthew clenched his jaw, his posture stiffening. Of course. Victor's smirk widened slightly before he turned and left, his presence leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Lila looked at Matthew, her brows furrowed in concern. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Matthew exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated." Lila hesitated, then reached out to touch his arm lightly. "Well, if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Her simple gesture of kindness nearly undid him. For a moment, he considered telling her everything: the staged bankruptcy, his doubts about Charlotte, the weight of the lies he was carrying, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Lila. That means a lot." The rest of the evening passed quietly, but the encounter with Victor lingered in Matthew's mind long after he left the cafe. He knew the older man wouldn't back down, and whatever game he was playing, it was only just beginning. When Matthew returned to his penthouse, he found another message from Charlotte waiting for him. "I talked to my father.
He's worried about you.
We need to figure this out.
Call me."
He stared at the message, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and exhaustion. For the first time, he realized that his world, the world he had built so carefully, was unraveling faster than he could control. But then another message came through, this time from Lila. "Thanks for stopping by tonight. Hope you're okay." Matthew's lips curved into a faint smile. In the chaos of his life, Lila was quickly becoming the one thing that felt real, and for that, he was grateful. But as he set his phone down and looked out at the stormy city skyline, he knew the road ahead was only going to get harder. The battle with Victor, the truth about Charlotte, and the growing connection with Lila, it was all coming to a head. And Matthew wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. The tension in Matthew's office was palpable the next morning as Margaret walked in, her expression sharp, her tablet clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit, dropping into the chair across from his desk with an urgency that made Matthew put down the document he'd been pretending to review. "We have a problem," she said, her voice low but intense. Matthew leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "Let me guess. Victor." Margaret nodded. "He's been asking questions about the restructuring, but it's more than that. He's been reaching out to some of our clients, subtly of course, but the intention is clear. He's trying to sow doubt about the company's stability." Matthew's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "And the board?" he asked. "They're nervous," Margaret admitted. "I can manage them for now, but if Victor pushes harder, we could lose key support. And if Charlotte's involved..." The thought hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Matthew clenched his fists. "I'll deal with Victor. But what about damage control? Can we counter his narrative?" Margaret hesitated. "We can try, but it'll take time. And right now, time isn't on our side. We need a decisive move to regain trust, both internally and externally." Matthew exhaled sharply, standing and pacing to the window. The skyline stretched before him, a mix of opportunity and threat. He'd spent years building this company, shaping it into something his grandfather would have been proud of. Now all of it was hanging by a thread, thanks to a man who cared more about leverage than loyalty. "I'll meet with him," Matthew said finally, his tone steely. "Face to face. If he wants to play games, let's see how far he's willing to go." Margaret stood as well, her expression skeptical. "And Charlotte, I'll handle her too," he said, though the words felt like a lie. "Thanks, Margaret. I'll keep you updated." She nodded and left, her heels clicking against the polished floors. The sound echoed in the silence, a stark reminder of the battles waiting on the other side of his office door. The meeting with Victor was set for later that evening at an upscale restaurant downtown. Matthew arrived early, the controlled chaos of his day still buzzing in his mind. The restaurant was dimly lit, its sleek decor a perfect backdrop for high-stakes conversations and hidden agendas. Matthew spotted Victor at a corner table, nursing a glass of red wine and scrolling through his phone like a man who owned the world. Matthew approached, his expression unreadable. "Matthew," Victor said smoothly, standing to shake his hand. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "You made it impossible to refuse," Matthew replied, his voice even. They sat, and a waiter appeared almost instantly, taking their orders with practiced efficiency before disappearing again. Victor swirled his wine, eyes fixed on Matthew. Let's not waste time. I've been hearing troubling things about Hayes Real Estate, and as someone with shared interests, I thought it prudent to address them. Shared interests? Matthew asked, arching an eyebrow. Is that what you call undermining my company behind my back? Victor chuckled softly, his gaze sharp. Undermining?
Hardly.
I'm simply protecting my investments, and by extension, Charlotte's future. Surely you can understand that. Matthew leaned forward, his tone cold. What I understand is that you're meddling in things you don't fully grasp. The company is fine, Victor. Whatever rumors you've heard are exaggerated. Victor's smirk didn't falter. Perhaps. But perception is everything in business, isn't it? If people believe Hayes Real Estate is unstable, it doesn't matter what the truth is. The damage will already be done, and you're the one holding the match. Matthew shot back, his voice low but firm. Careful, Victor. You may think you're in control, but alliances are fragile. And Charlotte, she deserves security.
Stability.
If you can't provide that, perhaps it's time to reevaluate your priorities. Matthew's stomach churned, but he didn't let it show. Charlotte's security isn't your concern or your bargaining chip. This isn't a negotiation. Victor leaned back, his smile returning. Everything is a negotiation, my boy. You do well to remember that. The waiter returned, interrupting the tension with plates of elegantly arranged food. Neither man touched their meal, the air between them charged with unspoken threats. The conversation shifted to safer topics, market trends, mutual acquaintances. Matthew's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw Lila's name. The sight of it steadied him, a brief anchor in the storm. Victor noticed, tilting his head. Important call? Matthew slid the phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Nothing that concerns you. Victor chuckled softly. Of course not. Later that night, Matthew found himself driving toward Lila's neighborhood. He hadn't planned to see her, but after the meeting with Victor, he needed a reminder of what was real. The cafe was closed, its windows dark, but he spotted light spilling from a small storefront a few doors down. The faint scent of sugar and vanilla wafted through the air, drawing him closer. He stepped inside to find Lila bustling around a makeshift kitchen, her hair tied back and flour dusting her cheeks. She looked up, startled, but her face broke into a wide smile when she saw him. Matthew, she said, setting down a tray of cookies. What are you doing here? I was in the neighborhood, he said, his voice soft. Thought I'd check in. Well, you caught me in my natural habitat, she laughed, gesturing to the trays of baked goods. I'm catering an event tomorrow. Thought I'd get a head start. Matthew leaned against the counter, watching her work. Do you ever take a break? Not really, she admitted, her tone light but honest. But it's worth it. This is what I love. He nodded, the simplicity of her words grounding him. Lila, do you ever feel like you're fighting a battle you can't win? She paused, looking at him with quiet understanding. All the time. But you keep fighting anyway. Because some things are worth it. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, Matthew felt a glimmer of clarity. He didn't know what the future held, Victor's threats, Charlotte's loyalty, the company's stability, but he knew one thing for certain. Lila was worth fighting for. As she handed him a cookie and teased him about his inability to bake, the storm in his mind calmed, if only for a moment. In that moment, Matthew knew he wasn't ready to give up. Not on his company, not on the truth, and certainly not on the possibility of something real with Lila. But as the night wore on, the looming shadows of Victor and Charlotte reminded him that the hardest battles were still ahead. The grand ballroom of the City Club of Chicago shimmered under the light of its crystal chandeliers, their brilliance casting intricate patterns across the marble floors. The gala was in full swing, the city's elite mingling in tailored suits and glittering gowns, while soft classical music filled the air. Matthew stood near the edge of the room, nursing a glass of champagne and scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. His posture was calm, but his mind was on high alert. This wasn't just another social event. Tonight, he was stepping into the lion's den. Victor Reed was here, of course. His commanding presence was unmistakable as he worked the room with practiced ease, exuding confidence while shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. But Matthew could see the calculated sharpness behind every smile. This wasn't a man who came to socialize, he came to conquer. Matthew. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Charlotte approaching, her silver gown catching the light with every step. She looked stunning, as always, but Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that she was as polished and hollow as the champagne flute in his hand. "Charlotte," he said, his tone neutral. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, her smile tight. "You've been avoiding my calls." "I've been busy," Matthew said evenly, taking a sip of his champagne. She frowned, stepping closer to lower her voice. "This isn't the time to play games. My father is worried about your company, and frankly, so am I. People are talking, Matthew. They're saying Hayes Real Estate is on the verge of collapse." Matthew's grip on the flute tightened, but he kept his expression calm. "And what exactly are they saying?" "That you've lost control," she said bluntly. "That the board is panicking. That the restructuring is a sign of deeper issues." "Do you believe them?" he asked, his gaze steady. Charlotte hesitated, her eyes darting away for a fraction of a second before meeting his again. "I want to believe you, Matthew. But you're not giving me much to work with." "If there's something you're not telling me," she began. "Charlotte, this isn't just about me, is it?" Matthew interrupted, his voice low but firm. "It's about how this affects you, your father, your family's reputation." "That's not fair," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing. "I've stood by you." "Have you?" he asked, his tone cutting. "Because it feels like you're more worried about what this means for you than what I'm going through." She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when Victor's voice cut through the room. "Matthew." Victor approached, his tone jovial as he clasped Matthew's shoulder with a firm grip. That was just a shade too firm. "Victor, always a pleasure," Matthew said, his voice polite but strained. "Charlotte, darling, why don't you go check on the auction items?" Victor suggested smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Charlotte glanced between the two men, her expression unreadable, before nodding and walking away. As soon as she was out of earshot, Victor's smile faded, replaced by a calculating intensity. "You're walking a fine line," Victor said quietly. "This little act of yours is only going to hurt you in the long run." "What act?" Matthew asked, his tone equally quiet but laced with defiance. Victor smirked. "The restructuring. The sudden silence from your board. Do you think people aren't paying attention? If you're trying to bluff your way out of trouble, it's not working." "Maybe you're the one who's bluffing," Matthew replied, his voice cool. "Stirring up rumors, planting seeds of doubt. It's desperate, Victor, and it's transparent." Victor's eyes narrowed, his composure slipping for just a moment. "Careful, Matthew. You may think you're untouchable, but the higher you climb, the harder the fall." "I'll keep that in mind," Matthew said, his tone unwavering. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a few people to see." Victor stepped back, his smirk returning as he watched Matthew walk away. The tension in the air was palpable, but Matthew didn't let it show. He had expected Victor to be confrontational tonight, and he wasn't about to let the man rattle him. As Matthew moved through the crowd, exchanging polite greetings and brushing off probing questions, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Margaret. "Found something. Need to meet. Urgent." His pulse quickened. Margaret wasn't one to exaggerate. He quickly sent a reply and got an almost instant response. "West Lounge now." Matthew slipped out of the ballroom, his heart pounding as he made his way to the West Lounge. The corridor was quiet, the distant hum of the gala fading as he pushed open the heavy oak door. Margaret was already there, standing near a window with her tablet in hand. "What is it?" he asked, closing the door behind him. Margaret looked up, her expression grim. "I've been digging into Victor's recent moves, and I found something. He's not just spreading rumors, he's positioning himself to poach our biggest clients." Matthew's chest tightened.
"How?"
"By leveraging your so-called collapse," she explained, showing him the data on her tablet. "He's offering lower rates, faster turnarounds, and throwing in incentives to sweeten the deal." He's painting himself as the safer bet while making you look like a liability. Matthew stared at the screen, his mind racing. Victor wasn't just meddling, he was actively sabotaging Hayes' real estate. And with Charlotte's loyalty hanging by a thread, the implications were devastating. "Does the board know?" he asked. "Not yet," Margaret said. "But if this goes public, it could destroy everything. We need to act fast." Matthew exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "And Charlotte's?" Margaret hesitated. "I don't think she knows the full extent of what her father is doing. But if she does," the unspoken truth hung in the air. If Charlotte was complicit, it would mean the end, not just of their relationship, but of any trust Matthew had left in her. "I'll handle it," he said finally, his voice steady. "Keep this between us for now. I'll confront Victor directly." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained tense. "Be careful, Matthew. This isn't just business anymore. It's personal." As Matthew returned to the ballroom, the weight of Margaret's revelation bore down on him. The stakes had never been higher, and every decision he made from this point forward would determine the fate of Hayes' real estate and his own future. He spotted Charlotte near the auction tables, chatting with a group of donors. She looked radiant, her laughter effortless as she charmed everyone around her. But to Matthew, it felt like a facade, another layer of distance between them. "Charlotte," he said, his voice cutting through the conversation. She turned, her smile faltering slightly. "Matthew, everything okay? Can we talk?" he asked, his tone firm. Her eyes flicked to the donors, then back to him. "Of course." He led her to a quieter corner of the room, his mind racing as he searched for the right words. Finally, he met her gaze, his expression serious. "Charlotte," he began, "how much do you know about what your father's been doing?" Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb," Matthew said, his voice low but sharp. "He's sabotaging my company, undercutting my clients, and spreading lies about me. And I need to know if you're involved." Her eyes widened, genuine shock flashing across her face. "Matthew, I had no idea." He studied her carefully, searching for any sign of deception. But if she was lying, she was doing a damn good job of hiding it. "I want to believe you," he said finally, "but if you're keeping anything from me, anything, I need to know now." "I'm not," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "I had no idea. I'll talk to him. I'll fix this." But as she spoke, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that the damage was already done. And as the night wore on, he realized that the fight for his company and his future was only just beginning. The rain had returned, its steady rhythm tapping against the wide windows of Matthew's penthouse. The soft glow of the city lights outside painted streaks across the room, but the atmosphere inside was far from calm. Matthew sat at his desk, his head in his hands. Margaret's revelations replayed in his mind like a broken record. Every piece of evidence pointed to Victor's deliberate sabotage. And while Charlotte's reaction had seemed genuine, he couldn't fully trust her anymore. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking through his thoughts. He stared at the screen. Lila. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Lila had become a source of peace in the chaos, but tonight, he wasn't sure he could bring himself to put on a brave face. Still, something compelled him to answer.
"Hey."
"Hey," Lila replied, her tone equally tentative. I was thinking about you. You seemed a little off last time we talked." Matthew leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, it's been a lot. Want to talk about it? Or I can just listen." Her sincerity cut through his defenses, and before he knew it, the words were spilling out. Not everything, not the staged bankruptcy or Victor's sabotage, but enough to let her see the weight he was carrying. "It feels like everything I've built is slipping through my fingers," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "No matter how hard I try, someone's always there waiting to tear it down." There was a pause on the other end before Lila spoke, her voice steady. "Matthew, you're one of the most determined people I've ever met. If anyone can handle this, it's you." Her confidence in him was like a lifeline, pulling him from the edge of despair. "Thanks, Lila. You have no idea how much I needed to hear that. Well, if you ever need a reminder, you know where to find me. she said with a small laugh. And I know this might sound crazy, but sometimes stepping away helps. Even for just a little while. Matthew smiled faintly. I'll think about it. Thanks again. They said their goodnights, and as Matthew hung up, he felt a small sense of relief. Lila's words had given him clarity, but they also reminded him of what he was fighting for. Not just his company, but something real, something honest. The next morning, Matthew was back in the office, his focus sharper than it had been in days. Margaret was already waiting for him, her tablet loaded with updates. Anything new? He asked, sitting down across from her. Margaret handed him the tablet. Victor's been ramping up his efforts. He's already poached 2 of our smaller clients and is circling a few bigger ones. If he lands them, it could be a tipping point. Matthew's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the data. What about the board? They're nervous, but they're still with us for now. We need to act fast to keep them on our side. Matthew nodded, his mind racing. We need leverage. Something to counter Victor's narrative. Margaret hesitated before speaking. There's one more thing. I had someone look into Victor's financials. His company isn't as solid as he's making it seem. Matthew's eyes narrowed. How bad is it? Bad enough, Margaret replied. If we can verify this, it could turn the tide. But it's risky, Matthew said, leaning back, considering his options. He knew exposing Victor's weaknesses could backfire, but it was a chance he had to take. Let's do it quietly. I don't want this blowing up in our faces. Margaret nodded, her expression resolute. I'll get started. As she left, Matthew's phone buzzed with a message from Charlotte. We need to talk.
Please.
He stared at the screen, conflicted. He wasn't ready for another confrontation, but ignoring her would only make things worse. With a deep breath, he replied, Meet me at the office.
Noon.
Charlotte arrived right on time, her expression anxious as she stepped into Matthew's office. She looked different, less composed, more vulnerable. For a moment, Matthew wondered if her concern was genuine. Matthew, she began, sitting down across from him. His tone was calm, but guarded. I talked to my father, she said, her voice trembling. He admitted to reaching out to your clients. He said it was just business, but I know it's more than that. I didn't know, Matthew. I swear. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time in weeks, he saw a flicker of honesty. I believe you, he said quietly. But that doesn't change what he's done. I'll talk to him again, Charlotte insisted. I'll make him stop. Matthew shook his head. This isn't just about stopping him, Charlotte. It's about trust. And right now, I don't know if I can trust you or anyone in your family. Her face crumbled, and for a moment, Matthew felt a pang of guilt. But he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. Matthew, please, she said, her voice breaking. I love you. I want to fix this. He studied her carefully, his emotions warring with his logic. If you really mean that, you'll prove it. Not with words, but with actions. Charlotte nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I will. I promise. As she left, Matthew felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. He wanted to believe her, but his instincts told him to stay cautious. Later that afternoon, Margaret returned with news. We've confirmed it, she said, handing Matthew a file. Victor's company is hemorrhaging money. He's using smoke and mirrors to keep up appearances. Matthew flipped through the file, his jaw tightening. This is it. We can use this to turn the tables. But carefully, Margaret warned. If this gets out too soon, it could hurt us as much as it hurts him. I know, Matthew said, his mind already working on a plan. Let's move quickly, but quietly. We're not losing this fight. That evening, Matthew found himself back at the cafe, drawn once again to the warmth and simplicity of Lila's world. She greeted him with a smile, her eyes lighting up as he walked in. You're becoming a regular, she teased, handing him his usual order. Maybe I just like the company, he replied, his tone lighter than it had been all day. As they talked, Matthew felt the weight of his day begin to lift. Lila's laughter was like a balm, soothing the edges of his frayed nerves. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. But deep down, he knew the battle was far from over. And as he left the cafe that night, the storm clouds of Victor's schemes and lies still loomed on the horizon, waiting to test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The relentless ringing of Matthew's phone jolted him awake. His hand fumbled on the nightstand before he grabbed it, blinking at the name on the screen. Lila. It was nearly 2 a.m. Lila, he answered, groggy. Matthew, I'm so sorry to call this late, but it's Maggie. She's burning up, and I don't know what to do. I've tried everything, but her fever won't go down. Her voice was frantic, each word more panicked than the last. Matthew's sleep-fogged mind snapped into focus. Maggie, Lila's younger sister. He remembered Lila mentioning her health struggles, though she hadn't gone into detail. Where are you? He asked, already swinging his legs off the bed and grabbing his keys from the dresser. At home, Lila said, her voice trembling. I didn't know who else to call. Don't worry. I'm on my way. Stay with her. I'll be there in 10 minutes. He hung up before she could respond, throwing on a jacket and grabbing his wallet. The cold Chicago night greeted him as he stepped into the elevator. The streets were eerily quiet, the city's usual hum muted under the glow of streetlights. When he pulled up outside Lila's apartment, she was already at the door, her face pale, her hair disheveled. Maggie, she breathed, her relief palpable as he stepped inside. Thank you for coming. Her small apartment was modest but warm, filled with personal touches, a framed photo of her and Maggie on the mantel, a colorful quilt draped over the couch. But tonight, the air was heavy with worry. Maggie lay on the couch, her cheeks flushed with fever. She stirred weakly as Matthew approached her. Her small frame barely moved under the weight of the blanket. Have you called her doctor? Matthew asked, his voice steady but urgent. I tried, but it's so late, Lila said, her hands trembling. And I can't afford an ER visit right now. Don't worry about that, Matthew interrupted, his tone firm. She needs care, and we're going to get it. Without waiting for Lila to argue, he scooped Maggie into his arms with surprising ease. The girl barely stirred, her head resting limply against his shoulder. Lila followed close behind, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. The drive to the hospital was tense, the silence broken only by the sound of Maggie's shallow breathing. Lila sat in the back seat, her hand gently stroking her sister's hair, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Matthew focused on the road, his grip on the wheel tight, as they approached the emergency entrance. Hours passed in a blur of waiting rooms and worried glances. Maggie had been immediately taken in for treatment, leaving Leah and Matthew in the sterile hospital corridor. Leah paced back and forth, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She's going to be okay, Matthew said gently, standing to stop her pacing. He placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Maggie's strong, and so are you. Leah looked up at him, her eyes glassy. I feel like I'm failing her. She's all I have, and I can't even keep her safe. You're not failing, Matthew said firmly. You've done everything you can. Calling me tonight wasn't a failure. It was brave. Leah's lip trembled, and she looked away, brushing a tear from her cheek. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't picked up. You don't have to do this alone, Leah, he said softly but steadily. Not anymore. She looked back at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. Before she could respond, a doctor approached, clipboard in hand. Are you family? He asked, glancing between them. She's my sister, Leah said quickly, stepping forward. Is she okay? The doctor nodded, offering a small smile. She's stable now. The fever was caused by an infection, but we've started her on antibiotics, and she's responding well. She'll need rest, but she should be fine. Leah exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging with relief. Thank you. Thank you so much. The doctor gave a reassuring nod before disappearing down the hall. Leah turned to Matthew, tears streaming down her face. She's okay, she whispered, her voice cracking. She's really okay. Matthew smiled softly, reaching out to pull her into a hug. She clung to him tightly, her tears soaking into his shirt as he held her. For a moment, the weight of the night lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. By the time they returned to Leah's apartment, The first rays of dawn were breaking over the city. Maggie was asleep in her room, her fever gone but her energy still low. Leah sat on the couch, cradling a mug of tea. Matthew handed her a blanket. "You didn't have to stay," she said, though her tone was grateful. "I wanted to," Matthew replied, sitting down beside her. "Besides, I wouldn't have slept anyway." Leah smiled faintly, exhaustion evident in her face. "You were amazing tonight. I don't know how I'll ever thank you." "You don't have to," he said simply. "I meant what I said earlier."
You're not alone, Leah.
"Not anymore." Her eyes searched his, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. There was something unspoken between them, a connection deeper than words. But before either could act on it, Maggie stirred in the next room, breaking the spell. Leah stood quickly, her maternal instincts kicking in. "I should check on her." Matthew nodded, watching as she disappeared down the hall. His chest felt tight, a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. In Leah, he saw something he hadn't realized he was missing: genuine kindness, resilience, and a sense of purpose that went beyond wealth or ambition. When Leah returned, she looked more at ease, her movements slower as exhaustion caught up with her. "She's asleep," she said, sitting back down beside him. "I think she'll be okay now." "That's good," Matthew said, his voice low. "You should get some rest too." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm too wired to sleep, but you've done more than enough." "I don't want to keep you." Matthew hesitated, torn between leaving and staying. Finally, he stood, his movements slow. "If you need anything at all, just call me." "I will," she promised, walking him to the door. As he stepped out into the crisp morning air, Matthew felt a strange sense of clarity. The chaos with Victor and Charlotte still loomed, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he'd done something that truly mattered. And as he drove away, Leah's voice echoed in his mind. "You're not alone." The words felt truer now than ever, and for the first time, Matthew allowed himself to believe them. The boardroom at Hayes Real Estate was quiet, an unnatural hush falling over the room as Matthew walked in. The usual hum of conversation among the board members ceased, their wary eyes following him as he moved to the head of the long oak table. Margaret stood to the side, her expression tense but steady, a stack of folders in her hand. Matthew knew why they were uneasy. The rumors about the company's supposed instability had spread like wildfire, stoked by Victor's manipulative campaign. Some of the board members had started to waver, questioning his ability to lead. Today, Matthew needed to silence those doubts. He stood at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping the room. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know there's been a lot of speculation lately, and I want to address it head-on." Margaret stepped forward, distributing the folders. "These are updated financials and projections for the next quarter. As you'll see, Hayes Real Estate remains solid. The restructuring has strengthened our foundation, not weakened it." The room buzzed with murmurs as the board members flipped through the documents. Matthew allowed them a moment before continuing. "What we're facing isn't about numbers or market trends," he said. "It's about perception. And that perception has been deliberately manipulated. Victor Reed has been targeting our clients, spreading false information about our stability to position his own company as a safer alternative." His words hung in the air, and several board members exchanged uneasy glances. "But here's what he doesn't want you to know," Matthew continued. "His company is in far worse shape than ours." Margaret stepped forward again, pulling up a presentation on the large screen at the front of the room. "We've conducted a deep dive into Reed Holdings' financials. Their cash flow is severely strained, and they've been relying on short-term loans to cover operating costs. If even one major deal falls through, they'll face a serious crisis." The board members leaned forward, their interest piqued. "This isn't just a business strategy," Matthew said, his voice hardening. "It's desperation. Victor is using smoke and mirrors to distract from his own vulnerabilities. But we're not going to let him undermine us any further." The murmurs grew louder, and the tide in the room clearly shifted. Matthew could feel the momentum building, but he knew this wasn't the end of the battle. I'm scheduling meetings with our top clients to reassure them of our stability and vision for the future, he continued. But I need your support. If we stand united, we not only weather the storm but come out stronger. The room fell silent again, but this time, the tension had eased. One by one, the board members nodded, their confidence in him visibly returning. Let's move forward, said Alan Grant, one of the senior board members. We trust you, Matthew. Margaret gave him a subtle nod, and Matthew felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For now, he had their trust. But the real fight was still ahead. That evening, Matthew sat in his office, the glow of the city lights casting long shadows across the room. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he picked it up, seeing a message from Charlotte. Can we meet? I need to talk to you. He stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He hadn't spoken to Charlotte since their tense conversation at the gala, but he knew this confrontation was inevitable. With a resigned sigh, he replied, My place, 8 p.m. Charlotte arrived precisely on time, her appearance as immaculate as ever, but her usual air of confidence was replaced by something more hesitant. Matthew, she said as she stepped inside, her voice softer than usual. Thank you for seeing me. He nodded, motioning for her to sit on the couch. He remained standing, his arms crossed. What do you need? Charlotte looked down, wringing her hands. I talked to my father again. He told me everything. Matthew's eyes narrowed. Everything? Charlotte nodded, her voice trembling. About the clients, the rumors, all of it. He admitted to trying to sabotage you, but he claimed it was just business, protecting our interests. My interests, Matthew replied sharply. And what do you think? She looked up at him, her eyes glassy, with unshed tears. I think he was wrong. And I think I was wrong for not seeing it sooner. Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret, but Matthew couldn't ignore the months of doubt and betrayal that had led to this moment. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Charlotte, he said quietly. Your father's actions nearly destroyed everything I've worked for. And you stood by and let it happen. I didn't know, she insisted, her voice breaking. Matthew, you have to believe me. I didn't know how far he'd gone. But you knew enough, Matthew interrupted, his tone cold. You knew he was meddling, and you chose to look the other way. That's just as bad. Tears streamed down her face, and she made no effort to wipe them away. I love you, Matthew, she whispered. I've always loved you. Can't we fix this? Matthew looked at her, his heart aching with a mix of anger and sorrow. He wanted to believe her, to forgive her, but the trust between them was shattered. He didn't know if it could ever be repaired. I don't think we can, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte let out a shaky sob, her shoulders trembling. For a moment, Matthew almost reached out to comfort her, but he stopped himself. This was the end of something that should have ended long ago. Goodbye, Charlotte, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. She stood slowly, her tears glistening in the dim light. Goodbye, Matthew, she said, her voice breaking. Then she turned and walked out the door, leaving behind an emptiness that Matthew wasn't sure how to fill. The next morning, Matthew met with Margaret to finalize their strategy against Victor. The meetings with clients were set, and the evidence of Reed Holdings' instability was ready to be presented. But even as he threw himself into the fight, his mind kept drifting to Lila. That evening, he found himself at the cafe again, the warmth of the familiar space drawing him in. Lila greeted him with a smile, her presence as comforting as ever. Tough day, she asked, sliding his usual drink across the counter. You could say that, Matthew replied, his lips quirking into a faint smile. But it's getting better. They talked for hours, their conversation easy and unguarded. As Matthew watched her laugh, her eyes sparkling in the soft light, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit before. Lila wasn't just a source of comfort. She was a reminder of everything he'd been missing: kindness, authenticity, and a sense of home. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope that the battles he was fighting might lead him to something worth holding on to. But as the evening wore on, he couldn't shake the shadow of Victor's schemes or the weight of the choices still ahead. The fight wasn't over, and the stakes had never been higher. The grand hall of the prestigious landmark hotel shimmered with opulence. Glittering chandeliers hung high above the polished marble floors, and the air buzzed with the sounds of hushed conversations, the clinking of glasses, and occasional bursts of laughter. It was the annual real estate gala, a cornerstone event where the city's most influential players gathered to flaunt their success, forge alliances, and measure themselves against their competitors. Matthew stood near the entrance, his tailored navy suit immaculate, his posture exuding calm confidence. Yet beneath the surface, he was anything but calm. This night wasn't about mingling or exchanging pleasantries. It was the battleground he had been preparing for. Tonight, he would confront Victor Reed publicly and turn the tide of the narrative Victor had so carefully constructed. Margaret approached, her expression sharp and focused. "Everything's set," she said, handing him a sleek black folder. "I confirmed with the AV team. The presentation will be ready when you give the signal." Matthew nodded, clutching the folder tightly. "Good. And the board?"
"They're on edge," she admitted.
"Victor's been working the room all night. If we don't handle this perfectly, we could lose them." "We won't," Matthew said firmly, though his stomach churned with anticipation. As the evening progressed, Matthew watched Victor navigate the room like a seasoned predator. His smile was charming, his laughter disarming, but Matthew knew better. Victor wasn't here to celebrate. He was here to finish what he'd started. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice announced from the stage, cutting through the hum of the crowd. "Please join us for tonight's keynote presentation, delivered by none other than Matthew Hayes, CEO of Hayes Real Estate." Polite applause erupted, but it was reserved. Matthew straightened his tie, his heart pounding as he made his way to the stage. He glanced at Victor, who stood near the back of the room, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," Matthew began, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "It's an honor to stand here tonight among so many respected colleagues and competitors. This industry has always been about more than just buildings and numbers. It's about trust, vision, and resilience." The crowd listened intently, their curiosity piqued. Matthew paused, letting the weight of his next words settle over the room. "Recently, my company has faced challenges that some have used as an opportunity to question our stability and integrity. Tonight, I want to set the record straight." He gestured toward the screen behind him, and a slide appeared, displaying detailed financial charts. "These are Hayes Real Estate's financials as of this quarter. As you can see, we remain strong, with a clear plan for growth and stability. The restructuring we implemented was not a sign of weakness, but a strategic move to adapt to changing market conditions." The murmurs in the room shifted, skepticism giving way to interest. Matthew's gaze swept the crowd, landing briefly on Victor, who now stood motionless, his eyes narrowed. "But this isn't just about numbers," Matthew continued. "It's about the truth. Unfortunately, not everyone here tonight values transparency as much as we do." He clicked to the next slide, revealing damning data on Reed Holdings. Gasps rippled through the audience as the screen displayed evidence of financial instability, mounting debts, and unethical practices. "Reed Holdings," Matthew said, his voice cutting through the silence, "a company that has been positioning itself as a beacon of stability while quietly hiding its own cracks. This is the reality Victor Reed doesn't want you to see." Victor stepped forward, his composure faltering. "This is outrageous," he barked, his voice echoing through the hall. "You have no right." "I have every right," Matthew interjected, his voice calm but firm. "You've spent months undermining my company, spreading falsehoods, and manipulating clients. But the truth always comes to light, Victor." The tension in the room was palpable as the crowd turned to Victor, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, one of the board members from Reed Holdings stepped forward. "Is this true, Victor?" the man demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Have you been hiding this from us?" Victor's silence spoke volumes. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, the tide clearly turning against him. Matthew stepped down from the stage, approaching Victor directly. "This ends tonight," he said quietly, his voice low enough for only Victor to hear. You've built your empire on deception, and now it's crumbling. Walk away before you drag everyone down with you." Victor glared at him, his jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he might retaliate, but then his shoulders sagged. He turned away, disappearing into the crowd. The sight of his retreat felt like a victory, but Matthew knew this was only the beginning. Margaret appeared by his side, her expression a mix of relief and triumph. "You did it," she said softly. "For now," Matthew replied, his voice steady but weary. "There's still a lot to clean up." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and reassurances. By the time Matthew left the gala, the weight on his shoulders felt slightly lighter. But as he stepped into the cool night air, he found himself thinking not about Victor or the company, but about Lila. He drove straight to the cafe, knowing it would be closed but hoping she might still be there. The lights inside were dim, but he could see her silhouette moving behind the counter. He knocked gently, and she looked up, surprised but smiling as she unlocked the door. "Matthew," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What are you doing here? It's so late." "I needed to see you," he admitted, his voice quiet but sincere. She tilted her head, studying him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Rough night." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But it ended better than I expected." They sat together in the quiet cafe, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. Matthew told her about the gala, about Victor's retreat, and the weight that had been lifted. Lila listened intently, her expression soft and encouraging. "You're incredible, you know that," she said when he finished. "Standing up to someone like Victor. It takes guts?" "Maybe," Matthew said, his smile growing. "But I couldn't have done it without you." "Me?" Lila asked, laughing softly. "I didn't do anything. You reminded me of what's worth fighting for," he said, his voice steady as he met her gaze. "And that made all the difference." Lila's cheeks flushed, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the world outside fading away. Matthew didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. And for now, that was enough. The crisp morning air carried the faint hum of Chicago's bustling streets as Matthew stood on the balcony of his penthouse, his hands gripping the railing. Below, the city moved with its usual chaotic rhythm, a reminder that life went on no matter the battles fought above it. For the first time in months, Matthew felt a strange sense of calm, not from everything being resolved, but from finally confronting the truth. Victor was out of the picture. His schemes had been exposed, his influence diminished, and his credibility shattered. Hayes Real Estate had weathered the storm, with key clients reaffirming their loyalty after Matthew's direct intervention. Yet standing here now, Matthew couldn't ignore the feeling that his greatest accomplishment wasn't in salvaging the company, but in finding a new sense of clarity about his own life. His phone buzzed on the table behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. He walked over, glancing at the screen. It was Margaret. "Morning, Margaret," he answered, his tone lighter than usual. "Good morning," she replied, her voice tinged with a rare note of warmth. "Just wanted to give you an update. Reed Holdings officially filed for restructuring this morning. Looks like Victor's finally facing the consequences." Matthew nodded, a sense of closure washing over him. "Thanks for letting me know." "By the way," Margaret continued, a hint of curiosity in her voice, "you seemed different at the gala last night. More at ease. Anything you want to share?" Matthew chuckled softly. "Let's just say I've got my priorities straight." "Good to hear," Margaret said. "I'll see you at the office." As the call ended, Matthew set his phone down and turned back to the view. Priorities? The word lingered in his mind, drawing his thoughts to Lila. She had been his anchor through this storm, her unwavering kindness and strength reminding him of what truly mattered. He had spent so long chasing success, building walls around himself, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to truly connect with someone. It was time to change that. The scent of freshly baked bread and coffee greeted Matthew as he stepped into the cafe later that morning. Lila was behind the counter, her hair tied back and a flour smudge on her cheek. She was handing a customer their order when she saw him. Her face lit up with a smile that made his chest tighten in the best way. "Matthew," she said, walking over as the last customer left. "You're up early." "I could say the same about you," he replied, leaning against the counter. "Don't you ever take a break?" She laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Not when there's work to be done. Besides, it's what I love." Matthew reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope and sliding it across the counter. Lila raised an eyebrow. Her curiosity piqued. "What's this?" she asked, picking it up. "Open it," he said, his tone soft but insistent. She carefully tore open the envelope, pulling out a single piece of paper. Her eyes widened as she read it, her hand flying to her mouth. "Matthew, is this?" "It's a lease agreement," he said, his voice steady. "For that space you mentioned downtown. The one you've always dreamed of for your bakery." Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at him. "I can't accept this, Matthew. This is too much." "It's not," he said, reaching across the counter to take her hand. "You've given so much to everyone around you, Lila. Let me give this to you." She shook her head, her emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Why would you do this?" "Because you deserve it," Matthew said, his gaze unwavering. "And because I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a long time." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath as she looked at him, her tears spilling over. Then, with a small laugh, she stepped around the counter and threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Matthew held her close, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. In that moment, he knew he had made the right choice, not just with the lease, but with opening his heart to her. Weeks passed, and the grand opening of Lila's Bakery was a celebration unlike any other. The small downtown space had been transformed into a warm, inviting haven filled with the smell of fresh pastries and the sound of laughter. Friends, neighbors, and even some of Matthew's colleagues filled the shop, their joy contagious as they sampled Lila's creations. Maggie flitted through the crowd, her energy restored and her smile radiant as she handed out cookies. Matthew stood by the counter, watching Lila interact with her customers, her face glowing with happiness. "You've created something amazing here," he said when she joined him. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, her smile soft. "You would have found a way," he said, his voice full of conviction. "You always do." She looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude, and something deeper still. "Thank you." Matthew reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Lila, I want to ask you something." Her smile faltered slightly, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he dropped to one knee, his gaze never leaving hers. "Lila Hart," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "You've shown me what it means to truly live, to love without expectation, and to find joy in the simplest moments. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The room erupted in cheers and applause as Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into a kiss that spoke all the words he couldn't say. For the first time in his life, Matthew felt whole, complete in a way he hadn't known was possible. As they held each other, the bakery buzzing with celebration around them, Matthew knew this was just the beginning. Together, he and Lila would build a life filled with love, resilience, and the kind of happiness that no storm could ever take away. And for the first time, he felt truly at home. Please share your thoughts about this story, and let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching.